It's the Kyle Heimann Show on Redeemer Radio.
This is Kyle Heimann, and joining us today to talk about his book, Catholic and Curious, Your Questions Answered, which actually there's a ton of questions answered in here, is Monsignor Charles Pope. Thank you for being here, Monsignor.
Yeah, good to be here. Thanks.
Do people ever get confused with your last name being Pope?
Yeah, right. It's a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun as a priest to have that name. Yeah. Are you the Pope? What? You got to be kidding. People look at me and say, you're kidding, right? You know?
Yeah. Do you get a lot of questions from your parishioners that you have to answer?
I do, and this particular book, Catholic and Curious, though, came from the news column I write for our Sunday Visitor, and some of them come from my parishioners, but people generally, write into the Sunday Visitor, or these days, of course, a lot more, they email their questions in, and so it's been about over 5 years now I've been writing that column, and this is kind of a compendium of some of the best and most interesting of those questions.
And how did that start in the first place, you being the person that they asked their questions to?
Yeah, it's interesting. I got a call one day, and by that time I'd been blogging, I guess, for about 5 or 6 years, and so I was a little bit known out there in the internet. So I think they just were looking for Father Mannion had been taking that helm. He moved on to other things at Liturgical Institute and so on. And so they were looking for a new author of that column, and they called me. So I said, "Well, sure, I'll do it." Yeah, and so it's been going well. I enjoyed it. It puts an interesting discipline on me because I'm not known for brevity. But
Yeah.
the column is 600 words, and I have to come right to the point, and that's reflected in this book. These questions and answers are fairly brief and concise.
Well, and imagine that's easier for some questions than others to try to condense things into a short little bite-sized answer. Do you have a hard time sometimes crunching down a complicated question?
I do, and sometimes, people will write in a long question, and, I have the option of, maybe breaking it into different questions and doing them at different times, or just saying, I just have to address the one area. But it can be challenging, but generally, I find it's been a good discipline to learn.
What kind of questions are the most common?
Well, I'll tell you, the probably in terms of, they come in different areas, but I get a lot of liturgy questions because, people care a lot about the sacred liturgy, and they're also frustrated, I think, at times with what they perceive as abuses or confusion. So I get a lot of that. In terms of the moral life, there's a lot of questions related to sexuality and how do we deal with, especially today with same-sex attraction becoming so widespread, at least in the way people talk about it. So I get a lot of those, and that's in terms of the moral life. A lot of questions, too, I think, come down to scriptural questions that come to me, are some of the more confusing, things in the Bible. Why does Jesus, say at one point, I offer you peace, and then he says, do you think I came for peace? I came for the sword. So people notice discrepancies in the scripture, and I love scriptural questions. It's always been my favorite area, and so I get a lot of those in here. And as I say, it's kind of hard to say, here's the one most common question, because there's just different areas of Catholic life. The moral life and aspects of the church and liturgy and sacraments are probably the most common, though.
Sure. How often are you able to answer the questions just off the top of your head, and how often do you have to go and look something up?
I would say probably about 50-50, because, there's going to just be times when I want to go check the Greek text, or I want to make sure what some of the fathers say about a scriptural question, or I certainly want to recite the catechism if I can, not just off the top of my head. There's going to be a few just pastoral questions, like, how do I deal with my sister-in-law who thinks women can't be ordained priests, and by gosh, well, how do I answer her? Those kinds of things, I think, generally I'm able to, pastoral questions, or how to help people to deal with situations in their family. Some of those I'm able to just kind of off the top of my head work with. But yeah, anytime I can cite, though, church documents and things, I try to do that.
Yeah. Well, in the introduction of the book, you say that our faith begins with a question, which you're referencing baptism. Can you explain what you mean and how it applies to those of us who were baptized decades ago?
Yeah, the question that the baptismal rite begins with is, and if an adult, but otherwise if it's an infant, the parents and godparents answer, but what do you ask of God's church? And the answer usually is faith or baptism. And what does baptism offer you? Eternal life. As I say, it begins with this question. What are you remember how Jesus, the very first question when Andrew was following him, he turned and he said to him, what do you seek? What do you seek? And, Rabbi, where do you stay? He says, come and see. So there's this beautiful reaching out of the human heart. And in a more extended sense, I think the fundamental questions that most people have are, who is God? Why do I exist? What's the purpose of my life? And who is this God that people keep talking about? And why do I have this yearning and longing in my heart? And so all of those are the kinds of questions that should keep us in that questioning mode. So we have questions, and God has questions for us. And the beautiful thing about questions is that they're often open-ended, and they're not simply answered in one fell swoop. We're always asking questions. We're always wondering. We're saying, why? And how come? And where does this go? Where does this lead? So all of those are just ways of saying it keeps us in that beautiful discussion with God.
Do you think some people are scared of the questions, scared of not knowing all the answers, and maybe intimidated by that?
Yeah, and part of the purpose of a book like this is to help Catholics to become better at answering those questions. We call that apologetics, right? Part of it's, though, it's always a legitimate thing, Kyle, to say, I don't know, let me get back to you on that, or let me go ask, or because this is, that's a humble response. There's going to be just times when we say, well, I'll tell you what, let me go ask someone, or let me go look that up, or let me get back to you. So that's always going to be a valid thing. But yeah, you're right. People get anxious about not only their questions, but the questions that people might ask them. And I tell you this much: we need to get back in the business of asking questions too. So often we Catholics are in response mode. We were either being attacked or just legitimately, sincerely questioned about our faith. But sometimes we can also ask other people questions. Someone will say, well, I think the Catholic Church is patriarchal, or I think the Catholic Church is outdated or outmoded or out of fashion, or the church teaching is bigoted or whatever. And you say, well, why do you say that? Can you tell me more? What do you mean? What do you think? Why do you think the church is this? And kind of put them, it's called the Socratic method, isn't it, right? Where we answer questions with questions, and we invite people to explore some of their own premises. And even if somebody says, well, some crazy pope said this, 1,000 years ago, you say, well, really, can you find that for me in writing? I've not heard that before. Or I'd like to know a little more about the context. Since it bothers you, could you look it up and find that for me?
Right.
So it's okay for us, I think, to invite people to explore some of their own premises and questions a little more, too.
We're talking with Monsignor Charles Pope. The book's called Catholic and Curious, Your Questions Answered. And is it true that there's 500 questions answered in this book?
Yeah. Technically, I think we aimed for 501. I just wanted to break through this.
Nice.
Yeah. And it's all broken up into sections. The table of contents is very nice. It starts out with God and then each of the members of the Trinity. And then, so the basic categories in the book are God, the Bible, liturgy and sacraments. And then we have the moral life, questions about the church's authority or structures and so on. And then lots of prayers and practices, sacramentals, blessings, holy water, angels, saints, things like that. And then there's other topics, like, for example, suffering and human origins, questions about the Genesis account, and so on. And then finally the four last things: death, judgment, heaven, and hell. And I had a little on purgatory in there too. So that's how it's broken. There's also a good index so that people can kind of quickly find certain subjects and study up on them that way. So as I say, hopefully it'll be a good resource, even as I hope it's pleasant enough reading, in the sense that you can flip through and say, well, that's a question I never thought of before. What is the answer? And so that's my hope anyway, that it'll be something that people find enjoyable, kind of a coffee table book.
Well, and I don't know if people can understand two things. One, it's a thick, big book because you have so many topics. But like you said, 501 questions answered, but it's only 506 pages. So, they really are pretty concise and easy to read answers to these questions. And I could definitely see, you just kind of read this cover to cover, or maybe like a classroom setting or a youth group or something like that, maybe taking one question a day or a week or whatever and just kind of working their way through. But like you said, the index has so many different topics that are, some of them just really hot button topics where you can quickly flip to 1, 2, or 5 different times that you answer questions on that topic. And so definitely people should check it out. What do you think was the hardest question to answer out of all of these?
Well, I'll be honest, at the emotional level, the hardest one to answer is when someone's suffered a terrible loss. And you say, where is God in these moments? And that, of course, with a very limited amount of time to answer it in a written column. But it's also emotionally wrenching. I know that we all struggle with the problem of evil and suffering But in terms of technical questions, there's going to be some of the more, well, I don't want to call them arcane so much, but they're harder to understand. Questions about the inner life of the Trinity and so on can be highly technical questions. Or, for me, I'm not a great canon lawyer, so I don't always remember all the twists and turns of canon law. So those are some technically difficult questions, but emotionally the questions about suffering. And also, I'll be honest, I think it's very wrenching today because there is so much meltdown in our culture about marriage, how we define marriage, the problem of same-sex attraction, and the problem of people living outside the church in terms of like cohabiting couples and these things. And people have very wrenching situations in their family. And there's some questions in here where they say, well, what can I say to my daughter who wants me to come to her lesbian wedding? Mm-hmm. Can I go, and what do I say, and how do I not burn all the bridges, or can I, and those are really wrenching questions, and they're hard to answer, and they're personally, I think, it just points to some of the struggles that we have in a kind of post-Christian culture where we're living very much at odds with what a lot of people think is reasonable and tolerant today.
Yeah, how do you balance that? How do you answer a question and, I guess, balance the truth with the tolerance or the love aspect?
Yeah, and what I basically do there is I say, listen, I think that one of the key things we want to say is if it's a son or a daughter who's, say, getting married outside the church, or it might be same-sex, or it just might be they're getting married outside the church to someone who's been married before, whatever, to simply say to them, look, I want you to know I can't come. I love you. I care about you. But for sincerely held religious beliefs, I can't come and celebrate. You're asking me to come and celebrate, and this is not something I can celebrate. I'm happy to talk with you more about this, but I do want you to know I love you and I want to stay in conversation with you. But I simply have to say I cannot celebrate this because I love God and I love what He's taught us, and for sincerely held religious reasons, I can't celebrate this day with you. I think that's sometimes the best we can do quickly if we have to write something. And then, of course, to remind people, look, there isn't an absolute rule that the church has. There may be some situations where a family member should go, but maybe make it clear that I'm struggling with this. This is not something I can really say that I approve of. So there can be situations where the church allows prudential judgments by family members that just because it would so poison the relationships that they could never really preach the gospel again, that somebody could go. So to try to reassure people, but to give them a way to say, look, I can't come in a situation is what I try to deal with there.
Well, and the book is called Catholic and Curious, and so obviously for Catholics who are curious about some of these questions, this is a no-brainer to get this book. Would it also be good for people that are curious about Catholicism?
Yes, as I say, I hope it would be helpful to both, those inside the church but the real goal of this is ultimately, evangelization. So that this would be a book that maybe for someone in RCIA or someone who's saying, well, why you Catholics are so crazy? Why do you think this and do that? And just say, well, here's a crazy priest who wrote a book about crazy Catholicism, and flip through and see what you think. Yeah. And I hope that I answer them in a way that's winsome enough that it wouldn't alienate somebody who wasn't Catholic. That's my hope anyway. Because, as I say, we always want to keep the discussion open. And so, yes, I do hope it's in. I do think that it's very valuable for those who are just wondering about Catholicism and why we do some of the things we do and believe some of the things we believe.
Sure. Well, where should we send people to get a copy of the book?
Well, it's certainly available at Our Sunday Visitor, osv.com. If you go there, they have their bookstore. It's also certainly available on Amazon. It's available at the EWTN religious catalog. So these are all sorts of different sources, and a lot of different Catholic bookstores now. I've been in several recently over at the Basilica and other places, and it's available in places like that as well.
All right. Again, it's called Catholic and Curious. Your questions answered. Thank you so much, Monsignor Charles Pope, for joining us today and sharing a little bit about the book with us.
Good. Thank you.